The massive hall stretched out like a small city, filled with beings that defied every law of nature James had ever known. He clutched his standard tablet tighter and tried not to stare too obviously at the creature sitting 3 rows ahead of him. It looked like a walking tree made of purple crystals, each branch ending in what might have been eyes or sensors. Every few seconds, it would chime softly, and colored lights would dance across its surface. To his right, a group of what James could only describe as giant praying mantises sat perfectly still, their triangular heads occasionally swiveling to observe their surroundings. Their movements were so precise and mechanical that James wondered if they were robots until one of them made a soft clicking sound that somehow conveyed amusement. Behind him, several beings that looked like living clouds of gas floated in clear containers that must have been their version of spacesuits. They pulsed with different colors, and James suspected this was how they communicated. One of them had turned a soft blue color and kept drifting closer to his seat, as if curious about the human. The Galactic Academy for Advanced Species Integration was nothing like the universities back on Earth. The ceiling seemed to stretch up forever, and the walls curved in impossible ways that made James's eyes water if he looked at them too long. Floating platforms carried supplies through the air, and the lighting came from organisms that looked like jellyfish swimming through the atmosphere. James pulled out his paper notebook, a habit that had earned him strange looks during the registration process. Most species used neural interfaces or crystalline data storage, but James preferred the familiar feel of pen and paper. The registration clerk, a being that looked like a walking flower with too many eyes, had stared at his primitive writing tools for a full minute before processing his enrollment. "Welcome, students of the 307th integration cycle," a voice announced, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The sound automatically translated into James's earpiece, though he could hear the underlying harmonics of the original language. It sounded like musical notes played on glass instruments. Professor Christara emerged from what James had thought was a decorative wall sculpture. She was easily 12 feet tall, her body composed of interconnected crystal formations that caught and scattered the room's bioluminescent lighting into rainbow patterns. As she moved, tiny chimes rang out, and James realized that this was probably how her species naturally communicated. "You represent the finest specimens of intelligence from across our galaxy," she continued, her translated voice carrying undertones of both authority and genuine excitement. "Some of you breathe methane. Others exist as pure energy. Many of you see in spectrums unknown to your neighboring species. Yet you are here because you all share one trait, the desire to understand life in all its forms." A ripple of what James assumed was approval swept through the assembly. The mantis creatures clicked rapidly, the gas beings pulsed brighter colors, and something that looked like a living boulder hummed in frequencies James felt more than heard. "This course will challenge your preconceptions about survival, adaptation, and biological diversity," Professor Christara announced. "We will examine creatures that have shaped the evolution of entire star systems. Organisms so perfectly adapted to killing that they have remained unchanged for millions of years." James made a note in his notebook, "Advanced Xenobiology, focus on dangerous species." He was looking forward to this. Earth's biology had always fascinated him, and the chance to study life forms from across the galaxy was beyond exciting. "You will learn to identify threats by scent, by movement patterns, by the electromagnetic signatures of their hunting behaviors," the professor continued. "You will understand how civilizations have risen and fallen based on their ability to coexist with their planet's apex predators." Several students shifted nervously. James noticed that many species seemed to have physical reactions to the professor's words. The crystal tree beings' lights dimmed to darker colors. The mantis creatures' antennae twitched rapidly. Even the gas beings seemed to compress themselves smaller within their containment suits. "Emergency medical stations have been placed throughout this facility," Professor Christara noted, gesturing to alcoves that James had mistaken for decorative elements. "Each station contains broad-spectrum antivenoms, neural stabilizers, and cellular regeneration matrices compatible with all registered species." This got James's attention. He'd known the course would involve dangerous specimens, but the professor was talking about these creatures like they were weapons of mass destruction. The medical stations looked more like emergency trauma centers than first aid posts. "Your survival may depend on your ability to recognize and respond to biological threats that have evolved over millions of years specifically to kill efficiently," the professor continued. "Some hunt by scent. Others by electromagnetic signatures. Many employ toxins so precisely calibrated that a single drop can end civilizations." The hall had grown quieter with each word. James looked around and realized that many of his classmates appeared genuinely frightened. The gas beings had turned pale yellow, which he was beginning to suspect meant anxiety. Several insectoid species were making rapid chittering sounds that his translator couldn't process. James felt a familiar excitement building in his chest. This was exactly why he'd applied to the academy. Earth had taught humanity to be resourceful, adaptive, and curious about everything, including things that wanted to kill them. He'd grown up hunting, fishing, and learning to identify which plants were safe to eat in the wilderness. His grandmother had taught him to prepare dishes that other cultures considered impossibly dangerous. "Tomorrow, we begin with living specimens," Professor Christara announced. "I trust you have all updated your medical files and emergency contact information." James smiled and made another note, "Living specimens tomorrow, remember to bring camera." Retry H. The containment unit sat in the center of the hall like a glass coffin filled with nightmares. James leaned forward in his seat, trying to get a better look at what was moving inside the transparent walls. The artificial habitat looked like a miniature alien landscape, complete with twisted metal trees and pools of bubbling liquid that glowed with an unsettling green light. Professor Christara stood beside the containment unit, her crystal body reflecting the eerie glow from within. Her translated voice carried a tone that James was beginning to recognize as the academic equivalent of a warning siren. "What you are about to observe," she announced, "represents 4 billion years of evolutionary perfection in the art of killing." The creatures inside the container were about 6 inches long, roughly the size of Maine lobsters back on Earth. But where lobsters were content to scuttle along ocean floors eating dead things, these specimens moved with the calculated precision of born predators. Their segmented bodies were covered in a shell that seemed to shift colors like oil on water, and their multiple legs ended in points that looked sharp enough to puncture steel. James watched one of the creatures climb up the side of a metal formation with fluid grace. 8 legs moved in perfect coordination, each step deliberate and silent. The thing's head was triangular, equipped with compound eyes that seemed to track movement outside the containment unit. When it turned to look directly at the class, James felt a chill run down his spine. Those eyes held an intelligence that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. "The Mordakian spine crawler," Professor Christara continued, manipulating the holographic display that appeared above the container. "Native to the death worlds of the Outer Rim, where the ambient radiation would kill most of you within minutes." The hologram zoomed in on one of the creatures, revealing details that made several students gasp audibly. The shell wasn't just armor, it was covered in tiny spines that could extend and retract like switchblades. Along the creature's underside, James could see bulbous sacs that pulsed with a sickly yellow fluid. "Their neurotoxic venom affects the nervous systems of 847 known species," the professor explained. "A single drop can paralyze a creature 50 times their mass within 2 minutes. Death follows within 10 minutes as respiratory and cardiac systems shut down." A 3-dimensional model of the venom's molecular structure appeared in the air. James studied it with genuine interest, noting the complex protein chains and recognizing several amino acid sequences that looked familiar from his biology studies back on Earth. Around him, his classmates were having very different reactions. The mantis creatures had gone completely still, their antennae flat against their heads in what James was learning was their species' version of terror. The gas beings had turned a pale, almost white color and were pressed against the far sides of their containment suits. Even the living boulder that sat in the reinforced section was humming in frequencies so low they made James's teeth ache. "These specimens have been responsible for the abandonment of 23 colonial settlements," Professor Christara continued. "The planet Zirion Prime was evacuated after a single breeding pair was accidentally introduced to the ecosystem. Within 6 months, they had eliminated all higher life forms on the continent." The professor touched a control, and the artificial environment within the container began to change. The lighting shifted to simulate different times of day, and James watched fascinated as the creature's behavior adapted instantly. During the simulated daylight, they remained hidden under rock formations. But as the lights dimmed to simulate evening, they emerged and began to hunt. One of the specimens had caught what looked like a small mechanical mouse, probably designed to simulate prey. James watched as the creature struck with lightning speed. Its front appendages clamped down on the target while its rear segments curved forward, bringing those venom sacs into contact with the victim. The whole attack lasted less than 2 seconds. "Notice the precision," Professor Christara pointed out. "They deliver exactly the right amount of venom for their target's body mass. No waste, no excess. 4 billion years of evolution have created the perfect biological weapon." James made notes in his paper notebook, sketching the creature's attack patterns and body structure. He found himself wondering about their life cycle, their natural habitat, and their role in their home ecosystem. The professor had mentioned they were from death worlds, which suggested they had evolved in extremely hostile environments. The Mordakian government classifies these creatures as a Class 9 biological hazard, the professor continued. Possession of specimens requires special permits and isolation facilities. Even their genetic material is considered too dangerous for most research applications. A student from somewhere near the back of the hall raised what might have been a hand, though it looked more like a flower with too many petals. Professor, how do their home worlds maintain any ecosystem with such perfect predators? An excellent question, Professor Kristara replied. The death worlds exist in a state of constant biological warfare. Every species there has evolved extreme defensive measures. Some produce toxins that make them inedible. Others have developed electromagnetic fields that interfere with predator nervous systems. A few have achieved symbiotic relationships with the spine crawlers themselves. James looked back at the creatures in their container. They had finished consuming their mechanical prey and were now grooming themselves with delicate precision. Their movements reminded him of cats cleaning their paws, except cats didn't have retractable poison spines and enough venom to kill a horse. The holographic display shifted to show survival statistics. James read through the data with growing amazement. No known antidote. No successful defensive strategies. No species had ever developed immunity to their venom. James raised his hand. James kept his hand raised politely, waiting for Professor Kristara to notice him. The massive crystal being was still pointing at the holographic display showing venom statistics when she finally turned toward the human section of the amphitheater. Yes, human James? She asked, her translated voice carrying what sounded like mild curiosity. James looked at the creatures in their container one more time, studying their segmented bodies and the way they moved across the artificial terrain. They really did remind him of the lobsters he used to catch with his grandfather off the coast of Maine. Same basic body plan, same jointed legs, even the same way of using their front claws to manipulate objects. Professor, are those edible? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. James watched as every single being in the hall turned to stare at him. The mantis creature's compound eyes swiveled in his direction with mechanical precision. The gas beings stopped their gentle pulsing and went completely still within their containment suits. Even the living boulder stopped humming. Professor Kristara's crystal body flickered through several color changes before settling on a deep purple that James was beginning to associate with confusion. Her translator made several clicking sounds before finally responding. I am not certain I understand your question, she said slowly. James glanced around at all the staring faces and realized he might have said something unusual. But the question seemed perfectly reasonable to him. The creatures looked like arthropods, they were about the right size for a meal, and most importantly, they were clearly made of meat under all that shell. Well, James explained, they look very similar to lobsters from Earth. Same basic body structure, jointed legs, segmented abdomen. And if their venom is protein-based, it would break down under heat treatment. So I was wondering if anyone has tried cooking them. A sound that James could only describe as a collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Several translator devices began making error noises as they struggled to process concepts that apparently had no equivalent in their databases. The professor's crystal structure was now cycling rapidly through different colors. You are asking, she said carefully, whether these creatures can be consumed as nutrition. Sure, James replied. I mean, the shell looks pretty thick, so you'd probably want to crack it open like a crab. And you'd definitely want to cook them thoroughly to denature any toxins. But the meat inside is probably quite good. Predators usually taste better than scavengers because they have more muscle mass. A feathered being from the Altair system made a sound that James's translator rendered as horrified squawking. One of the gas beings turned a color that didn't exist in James's visible spectrum, though his universal translator helpfully noted it as existential dread yellow. Human James, Professor Kristara said, her voice climbing several octaves, these specimens contain enough neurotoxin to kill approximately 3,000 of your body mass. James nodded thoughtfully. Right, but that's assuming you eat the venom sacs raw. Most biological toxins are just complex proteins. Apply enough heat, and the molecular structure breaks down into harmless amino acids. We do this all the time on Earth with poisonous plants and venomous animals. The hall erupted into a chaos of translation errors. James heard clicking, humming, whistling, and what sounded like someone gargling with gravel. Several students had physically recoiled from him, and he was starting to feel like he'd committed some sort of cultural mistake. Professor Kristara held up several crystal appendages for silence. You are suggesting, she said slowly, that your species has developed methods for consuming lethal organisms. Well, yes, James said. We eat rattlesnakes, scorpions, pufferfish, castor beans after processing, certain mushrooms that would kill you if prepared incorrectly. My grandmother makes a wonderful dish with stonefish, that's one of the most venomous fish on our planet. The key is understanding which parts contain the toxins and how to neutralize them. A crystalline being near the front made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. James's translator gave up and just displayed UNTINSLAB, possible expression of cosmic horror. Your grandmother, Professor Kristara repeated slowly, voluntarily prepares lethal organisms for consumption. Oh, she's quite good at it, James said proudly. Won 3 cooking contests with her stonefish recipe. The trick is knowing exactly how long to cook it and which spices complement the natural flavor without masking it entirely. James pulled out his tablet and showed the class a photo from his personal files. It was a picture of his grandmother holding a platter of what looked to the aliens like miniature dragons arranged on a bed of colorful vegetation. These are called sea urchins, James explained. They're covered in poisonous spines, but the meat inside is considered a delicacy. We usually eat them raw with just a little lemon juice. The professor's translator made several processing sounds before giving up entirely. She switched to what James assumed was direct neural communication with the Academy's main computer system, because her responses started coming much faster. Your species catalog indicates that humans routinely consume organisms classified as biological hazards by 17 different galactic safety organizations, she announced, her voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a very disturbing report. If it tastes good and we can figure out how to prepare it safely, we'll usually give it a try, James confirmed. These spine crawlers actually look pretty tasty. I bet the meat would be sweet, like king crab legs. The mantis creatures began making rapid clicking sounds that James's translator identified as either nervous laughter or impending molt. Seek shelter immediately. James looked back at the containment unit where the Mordakian spine crawlers continued their deadly dance, completely unaware that they had just been reclassified from galactic nightmare to potentially delicious by a species that apparently viewed the universe's most dangerous predators as menu items. Professor Kristara stared at James for what felt like several minutes, her crystal body cycling through colors that James was fairly certain didn't exist in normal physics. Finally, she seemed to reach some kind of decision and began manipulating her holographic controls with movements that looked almost frantic. Computer, display Earth biological consumption database, she commanded. A new hologram appeared above the containment unit, showing what looked like a restaurant menu from hell. Images of creatures that would make most galactic citizens flee in terror were arranged in neat rows with descriptions like grilled, fried, and served raw with citrus. James watched his classmates' reactions with growing amusement. The mantis creatures had gone completely rigid, their compound eyes fixed on images of humans eating insects that looked remarkably similar to themselves. The gas beings had turned colors that James's translator couldn't even process, settling for descriptions like quantum nausea and temporal anxiety. This organism, Professor Kristara said, pointing to an image of a coiled snake, produces hemotoxic venom that destroys blood cells and tissue. Your species considers it cuisine. Rattlesnake tastes like chicken, James replied cheerfully. You just have to avoid the venom glands when you're cleaning it. Most of the toxin is concentrated in the head anyway, so you remove that first. A sound like breaking glass came from somewhere in the crystal being section. James's translator identified it as either profound existential crisis or mating call, seek immediate shelter. The professor switched to another image. This one showed a fish covered in spines that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Pterois volitans, she read from her database. Lionfish. Venomous spines containing neurotoxins that cause severe pain, breathing difficulties, and potential cardiac arrest. Oh, those are really good, James said enthusiastically. You have to be careful when you're filleting them because the spines stay venomous even after the fish dies. But the meat is flaky and mild, almost like grouper. My uncle used to spearfish for them in Florida. The living boulder in the reinforced section began humming in frequencies so low that James felt them in his bones. His translator gave up and simply displayed fear, magnitude unknown. Professor Kristara seemed to be working through some kind of internal process, her colors shifting rapidly between what James was learning to recognize as confusion, fascination, and deep concern. She pulled up another image. Fugu, she announced. Tetrodotoxin concentration sufficient to kill 30 adult humans. No known antidote. Your species pays money to consume this. Well, you need a special license to prepare it, James explained. Fugu chefs train for years to learn exactly which parts are safe to eat. The liver and ovaries are the most dangerous, but the muscle meat is supposed to be incredible. I've never tried it myself, but it's considered one of the ultimate dining experiences. A feathered delegate from the Altair system raised what might have been a wing. Human James, she said through her translator, are you saying your species voluntarily consumes organisms that could kill them? Only if they taste good, James replied. I mean, there's no point in risking death for bad food. This seemed to break something in the collective consciousness of the class. The mantis creatures began clicking so rapidly that their translator gave up and just displayed cascading system failure. Several gas beings had compressed themselves into such tight formations that James worried they might collapse into singularities. Professor Christara pulled up what appeared to be a comprehensive database of Earth's culinary traditions. Images flashed past of scorpions on skewers, tarantulas fried in oil, and something that looked like a spider the size of a dinner plate arranged on a bed of vegetables. Your species has developed cooking methods for organisms that other civilizations classify as weapons of mass destruction, she observed, her voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a horror novel. We prefer to think of it as expanding our dietary options, James said. Earth taught us to be resourceful. When you're competing with creatures that want to eat you, sometimes the best strategy is to eat them first. A crystalline being near the front made a sound like a chandelier falling downstairs. But how do you know which ones are safe to eat? It asked. James considered this seriously. Well, trial and error mostly. Though we've gotten pretty good at identifying which toxins can be neutralized and which ones you just have to avoid entirely. Generally speaking, if it's trying to kill you with poison, there's probably a way to cook around it. If it's trying to kill you with radiation or acid, that's harder to work with. Professor Christara had gone completely still, her crystal structure locked on a deep blue color that James was beginning to associate with system overload. Your species, she said slowly, has turned survival into a culinary art form. I guess you could put it that way, James agreed. Though most humans just call it being hungry and creative. The professor began pulling up more images from the Earth database. There were pictures of humans eating sea urchins, preparing blowfish, harvesting honey from bees whose stings could cause anaphylactic shock, and something that appeared to be a festival centered entirely around eating progressively more dangerous peppers. This capsaicin concentration, she said, pointing to an image of what looked like a small red weapon, would cause severe tissue damage to most species. Carolina reapers, James nodded. Yeah, those are pretty intense. There are whole competitions based on who can eat the most without, requiring medical attention. The hall had gone silent except for the sound of multiple translation systems crashing simultaneously. The Academy's communication network lit up like a solar flare within minutes of James's question. Professors across 17 departments suddenly found their message systems flooded with urgent requests, emergency briefings, and what appeared to be the academic equivalent of panic attacks. Dr. Vexton, head of survival studies, materialized in Professor Christara's laboratory in his emergency response form, a dense cloud of agitated purple gas that kept shifting between solid and vapor states. His translator was working overtime to keep up with his rapid-fire questions. Is it true? He demanded. Did the human really ask how to cook the spine crawlers? Professor Christara's crystal body had settled into a steady amber glow that James was beginning to recognize as her thinking color. She gestured toward the containment unit where the Mordakian specimens continued their deadly dance, completely unaware that they had become the center of an academic revolution. He did, she confirmed. And according to the Earth database, his species has successfully consumed organisms with comparable or higher toxicity ratings. Dr. Vexton's gaseous form compressed into a tight spiral. The Galactic Threat Assessment database is experiencing cascading failures. Half the entries are being automatically reclassified from extinction-level threat to human food item, and our systems can't process the contradiction. James, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in the student quarters. His dormitory hallway was constantly filled with curious beings who wanted to observe the human who considered galactic nightmares to be potential dinner. The mantis creatures had taken to following him at a respectful distance, their compound eyes tracking his every movement as if he might suddenly produce cooking equipment and start preparing something lethal. His roommate, a crystalline being named Flux who communicated through color changes and musical tones, had initially requested a transfer to different quarters. But after James showed him pictures of his grandmother's recipe collection, Flux had become fascinated by the concept of dangerous cuisine, and was now attempting to catalog every toxic organism in the Academy's database by potential flavor profile. Human James, Flux chimed one evening, his surface shifting to curious green. Your database indicates that your species consumes organisms that produce sulfuric acid internally. How is this possible without digestive system dissolution? James looked up from his homework, which involved calculating the theoretical nutritional value of various galactic predators. Oh, you mean those little mollusks from the sulfur springs? You don't eat the acid sacs, just the muscle meat. Though I heard some chefs in Tokyo figured out how to neutralize the acid and use it as a flavor enhancer. Flux's color shifted to what James had learned was existential confusion mixed with grudging admiration. The changes weren't limited to student quarters. The Academy's cafeteria had undergone what could only be described as a revolution. Chef Gornak, a being who looked like a walking mushroom with too many eyes, had initially been horrified by James's casual suggestions about expanding the menu. But professional curiosity had eventually won out over terror. "Human James," Chef Gornak had asked nervously, approaching with a tray of what looked like ordinary vegetables. "These root vegetables from Kepler 442b contain trace amounts of cyanide compounds. Your species has experience with similar toxins." James examined the alien vegetables with genuine interest. They looked like purple carrots with a crystalline structure that caught the light beautifully. "Cassava root on Earth has cyanide too," he explained. "You just need to process it correctly. Usually involves soaking, fermentation, or specific cooking methods that break down the glycosides." Within a week, the cafeteria was serving Earth-style preparations that had lines of curious students stretching around the building. Even species that didn't technically eat food were showing up to observe the process of turning deadly organisms into cuisine. Professor Christara stood before the Academy's board of directors, her presentation displaying charts that seemed to break several laws of physics. The board members, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy, sat in stunned silence as she explained the implications of human dietary habits. "The human approach to biological threats represents a complete paradigm shift," she explained. "While other species evolved avoidance behaviors, humans developed consumption strategies. They don't flee from dangerous organisms, they season them." Board Chairman Zephyros, whose species looked like a combination of octopus and tree, raised several tentacles in confusion. "Are you suggesting that humans are apex predators?" "I'm suggesting they're apex omnivores," Professor Christara replied. "They've turned the concept of dangerous to eat into challenging to prepare properly. Their entire culinary evolution is based on the principle that anything trying to kill them is probably edible with the right cooking technique." The implications were staggering. Species that had spent millions of years developing elaborate defensive mechanisms suddenly found themselves being evaluated not for their threat level, but for their potential flavor profiles. The Mordakian spine crawlers, in particular, were facing their first existential crisis in evolutionary history. James found himself fielding requests from professors across multiple departments, not as a student, but as a consultant. His schedule now included meetings with the Department of Xenobiology, Emergency Preparedness, Cultural Studies, and something called speculative gastronomy that apparently hadn't existed until the week before. "Human James," Professor Christara said during one of their consultation sessions, "your thesis proposal has been approved by the academic committee. Expanding galactic nutrition through applied xenogastronomy will be the first interdisciplinary study combining biology, chemistry, cultural anthropology, and culinary arts." James looked at the research proposal that would let him spend the next 2 years studying dangerous organisms from across the galaxy and figuring out how to cook them safely. It was everything he'd dreamed of when he'd applied to the Academy. The Mordakian spine crawlers continued their deadly dance in their containment unit, still unaware that they had been reclassified from galactic nightmare to research ingredient by a species that considered the universe's most dangerous predators to be an untapped culinary resource.